And one of the things that we have been looking on is ways to collaborate and create win-wins. And we're wondering if you're talking to the Department of Education about what should be happening with the construction of a new school. I think there's an opportunity to have a school of excellence. We talked about it a little bit before when the Deputy Secretary was here, of really kind of getting this right for the islands, for the students, for the future education of our fellow citizens, and also for the best use of taxpayers' dollars. So if you could just comment briefly where you might be on those, or if they're going to be in future supplementals.
Sure. So I think we can hit most of those. First, on resiliency, we've spent a lot of time thinking about ensuring that we harden our facilities, that you know, to the extent that cables can be buried, they're buried so that we don't have to replace poles going forward. Ensuring that we utilize technologies to make sure that, I mean, invariably there will be a hurricane here again, and make sure that we're not continually asking you for those types of monies. In regards to historic preservation, it's my understanding that the request is entirely for 106 monies, if you will. It is not a request for brick and mortar costs for private residents or private historic facilities. And that is the way I believe our request is structured. Do you have a follow-up on that?
My question was is that the end or future supplementals, even if you don't have a dollar amount?
So
are you done with the discussion?
I don't anticipate that we would be seeking a supplemental requesting money for private residences and those types of things as it relates to historic properties. I would not expect Interior to do that. Regarding education, I'm not specifically aware of the Miccosukee School, but I'm happy to get back to you on that this afternoon. Regarding the VI school, I am somewhat familiar with that, and I think that there are some discussions and dialogue that need to occur with the governor as well in terms of on specific pieces of property and other type things regarding location. We're happy to talk to the Department of Education about it, but I don't think that's functionally the immediate challenge as it relates. I think it's more of perspectives on location and property.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just say that getting a school up and running, and I know you didn't mean it this way, so I'm clarifying it for the record, is something of immediate need.
I completely agree with that.
I figured you did. I just wanted to be clear.
The federal government has, and there's a role other governmental entities have as well.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. You mentioned during your opening statement that I can't remember how many, 800 and some odd volunteers from the Department of Interior. By volunteers, do you mean Department of Interior employees that volunteered to go down there?
That's exactly what I mean, sir.
Okay.
Obviously, there have been volunteer efforts of folks that, you know, have just helped. But what I was specifically referring to there is the 560 people who've volunteered to go into these areas. And, you know, look, power, water, it's challenging conditions, and they're up for it, and they're motivated, and they're doing an incredible job. We have folks from Grand Tetons. We brought in smoke jumpers to actually clear some of the roads. You know, they really made a huge difference, but you know, they didn't have to step up.
And we thank them for that, and if you would thank them for this committee that, for the effort that they're doing down there. You mentioned 31 FEMA missions that you've participated in. That means FEMA has paid for these?
Well, I think the way it works technically is FEMA makes an assignment, gives it to us, and then we carry it out. And as part of that, I think it is reimbursed through FEMA as, I don't want to say an entitlement, but there is some sort of reimbursable agreement that deals with
what has this done to, not the FEMA part, but what has happened to the Interior's budget because of costs that are not reimbursed by FEMA? You said that there were volunteers from Teton National Park and other places. is there work there that's not being done because we have had to redirect resources to this? And what's been the impact on the Department of Interior overall?
So for our own facilities, the part of that is some of our requests, and that work is, we are, the way FEMA works is FEMA does kind of the public stuff. For our own facilities, we are expected to deal with those and then come to you, and that's what we have done. And there have been some really interesting efforts. For example, it turns out that Dry Tortugas has a boat, the Jefferson. We have actually used that to get supplies to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So there has been a lot of our own activity that isn't part of those 31 missions, and that is stuff that we ask you for.
Will this supplemental, will it make you whole?
Yeah,
so that we can actually, so that the activities that we expect the Department of Interior to do will
That's
continue?
absolutely my goal. Like,
Okay.
this is not at all to take away from those. And what really happened, I mean, candidly, is, a fire crew in Grand Tetons right now, there's snow.
Right.
So they're getting to spend some time in the Virgin Islands doing really hard work in a hot, very, very different temperate environment, but that's what they were willing to do.
Thank you.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you. Thanks very much for being here today. We've, I think as a committee, and thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for spending so much time on this. I think getting to know better from the delegate and the governor recently about some of the issues that they're facing was very helpful to us. And I think dealing with matters of the territory, as I'm sure you know in your new position, seems so complicated and confusing. And each one's treated differently, and there's a whole variety of things. So I'm just going to kind of ask you a general question because some of these things I'm just still trying to figure out. But it's my understanding, and some of this I got from Representative Plaskett, the questions that she suggested to the ranking member and I, that some things obviously are treated differently for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and in the administration's request, there is a waiver of the Stafford Act in order to rebuild infrastructure with more resiliency, and you've already talked a little bit about resiliency, and the request specifically states, for Puerto Rico in particular, the administration seeks as part of this request authority to provide public assistance under the Stafford Act without limitation of pre-disaster condition and causation. Now that doesn't apply to the Virgin Islands, and I know this is more complex than I completely understand because some things are FEMA and some things are Homeland Security, but obviously changes are attempting to be made. And in your role, as kind of the only agency that, in a sense, cares about the comprehensive picture of the territories, can you explain those differences to me and maybe talk a little bit more in depth about some of the things you kind of alluded to, the challenges that, there's specific expertise that other federal agencies or the Department of Interior have that just aren't available, particularly in the Virgin Islands, to the existing government. People are dealing with many of their own issues. There was already a lot of debt and difficulty going on there. So I guess I'd like to get a little more in-depth picture of how you see both how the territories are being treated differently and then also how you see some of that funding applying.
So the first thing I would say is I don't think that specific provision is part of the Department of the Interior's specific request. And so I can't speak specifically to the distinction, but I can tell you this from perspective. It wouldn't surprise me that there might be a perspective that authority was thought through for Puerto Rico and not necessarily thought through in the Virgin Islands. And the administration, frankly, may be very supportive of that modification, if that's what you're asking. The difference is really one of magnitude, I think. There are 3.4 million people in Puerto Rico, and it's a very significant circumstance. And there's approximately 100,000 people in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It's also a very significant circumstance. Puerto Rico's financial situation is much more visible. Congress has dealt with it. But you need to understand that USVI, although it's not in that particular state, is very fragile itself. And in both of these places, from my perspective, this is a incredibly serious challenge in that just for a minute, think of state revenues dropping very, very significantly, tax revenue not coming in because there's not an economic factor, and people not having the ability to get paid from their jobs. This is a very serious event, and it is going to require a lot of work between the administration and your body in helping it. And I can tell you emphatically that the administration is very, very concerned about this. Look, I've spent time in these places, and in my testimony I say that the personal toll is jaw-dropping, and it is. Just the amount of debris and trash is jaw-dropping. But the impact to people's lives is very real, and this is going to be, it is going to require both the executive branch and the Congress to treat this in a way that's somewhat different than we treat other events. And so that's just my unscripted answer to your general question.
Well, I appreciate your unscripted answer, and I completely concur. I think it's a unique situation, and I guess I would suggest that while I know it's hard to get all the estimates together, I noticed one thing is that the assistance to the territories program within the department's budget, it was originally cut. It's been restored, I think, in the House. But, I mean, that's one place where it seems to me we could be looking at funding to help with some of these things that aren't just about that. And I guess I'd ask you about that. And I would also say, in terms of, you're absolutely right. We have to look at this a little bit differently, or I would suggest, I think you're right. And Congress needs to play a role in it, but partly Congress can only play a role if it's really clear from the department where the needs are. And while, again, I'd say some of these things end up in other budgets and other places, you know, you're the only department that cares about what's the long-term future and how do you put all those pieces together. So I would think that, you know, kind of your oversight on where the funding comes from and making sure it's all there is really critically important.
I think a lot of people care, so I don't want to minimize that. I think everybody's heart goes out to these folks. Historically, one of the areas where we've seen your committee deal with some of the insular affairs impacts are on the matching side of the FEMA-type grants. That's not in our request. That's something to have a discussion about, and it may not even be something to have a discussion about in your committee. That's it may be somewhere else. I don't know that, and I'm not trying to impose that. But I really believe, and I want you to know that I've spent a lot of time understanding capacity and thinking about this. And the Insular Affairs Office is a relatively small office, and it has tremendous expertise in knowing and having relationships in those communities. I want to make sure that if you put money in those programs, that we can fully are capable of administering them. And I really believe that their technical expertise is in helping the government of the Virgin Islands and the federal government understand each other to not make missteps, for what it's worth.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your work.
Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and Mr. Deputy Secretary. In your written testimony, I believe you said you had the opportunity to see firsthand the problems that were there. This isn't a trick question. Had you been down prior to this so you could appreciate how much was devastated?
Number one, I'd never gone to the U.S. Virgin Islands before I went, or I think even to the Florida Everglades. But I will tell you this, that the devastation is obvious and apparent. When you fly over, when you fly into these islands, there are a multitude of houses, and I mean like every other house has a brand new blue tarp. When you drive down the road, walls are gone. Right. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize it got hammered.
No, I'm just wondering, because having had the opportunity to be there before and just seeing pictures of it now, obviously there's some utter devastation there. And you can appreciate that there's private enterprise that is involved and has made part of the islands, as well as on St. John, we have so much of the National Park Service. But also, on the island, there's a certain Keneal Bay. Did you have the opportunity to visit there?
I absolutely did.
And they have more than 500 employees, and they bring 15,000 guests to St. John's. I was over there a year ago, November, and had a chance to look at it. And they account for approximately $65 million in annual spending on the island. They operate under a retained use estate with the National Park Service, and that expires in September 2023. And in the last 7 years, no lease has been agreed upon, and the lease negotiations have crawled along. Obviously, with the destruction that's there, and for them to put the money in and continue to not only rehab what they have, but continue to exist, they were asking for a 60-year lease to be amended to that. Do you find those to be troublesome for some reason or a problem?
As a matter of policy, no. I will tell you this. Number one, I've been to Keneal Bay. I specifically went there. I think if you've been there before, you would be troubled if you returned. I don't think it would look at all like you remember.
Well, the pictures I saw made it almost look like it was set up as a base, since they were the only ones who had a working package plant, and they had the helicopters that were landing.
I'm sure they played a significant role. And but here's what I would say. Number one, the worst thing we could do is end up having the Park Service have that facility and not have anyone operating it. So that would be that's the worst case scenario. In terms of the 60 years, I have to say this honestly. You know, we have certain authorities for leasing, et cetera, that have certain time horizons. Those time horizons might not line up with the investment calculations anyone has to make what will be a very large capital investment. And I assume, and Mr. Calvert and others would know this better than me, I assume that, you know, they're looking to achieve a rate of return on a time horizon that makes sense for them. The other thing that I think would be worrisome from them, and probably is one of the reasons they would want to spend time visiting with you, is the timing and uncertainty of anything we do. It could take a long time. So I think in terms of finalizing an agreement and getting it done, and so I think that, you know, one thing we need to think about is, number one, we don't want this, like, we don't want it back in a meaningful way. Number two, it's in all of our interest to get this up and running quickly, so the quicker there's certainty, the better. Number three, we're not investors, so we don't know what the magical time horizon is, but I'm sure that that's something we're happy to debate. And to the extent we have authority, we're happy to work within that authority. And to the extent we don't have the authority, then it's kind of your job.
Well, I believe I believe in public-private partnerships like that, and as such, and the fact that somebody's willing to invest private money to fix up our facilities, they obviously need their rate of return so they can give money back to their investors, because this isn't manna. It's not just dropping from the heavens for us.
I completely agree with you, sir.
But I believe that the current terms are 40 years now, so they're asking you to, and if you can't do it, if it needs to be us, then I'd appreciate knowing where we have to go to allow this, because
you know, I don't want to try and figure out their positioning for us, but I think there's a window of time element, and different agreements have different conditions and expectations, and their use agreement may require your help if that's the model, and that's just the way it is.
Is it fair to say you're amenable to at least the discussion?
Beyond amenable.
Great. Now, when you get down to, you asked for the money here, and I noticed that, you know, and following up on Chairman Simpson's question, you know, some of this you say you're directed by FEMA to do, and so you do that, and you're reimbursed. How long is the delay, or is there any delay in the reimbursement between the works you're performing and the payments you're making, and you're receiving this money? Is it a month? Is it 2 months? Is it immediate?
Well, first off, those events aren't covered in our supplemental in terms of the FEMA response efforts.
But you're still
I don't think it's I don't think the delay is so significant that the agency has come to me and said, please help us with this. So I think it's almost like I don't want to say an entitlement, but I think that part of the system works okay.
Do you contract with private partners or private contractors then to help do some of this repair work and cleanup work, or do you rely on it all in-house, or? Because obviously there's some devastation to Cinnamon Bay and some of these other properties that we're on. I noticed the supervisors' buildings and stuff.
So almost all of that is, I mean, there absolutely, in terms of the recovery effort, there will undoubtedly be contracting for a good amount of that. In terms of the response efforts, I don't believe that Interior in any of their individual responses have used contractors to date. And I don't think we normally would, but I would have to check and get back to you on that with absolute certainty.
No one can predict when these things occur, obviously, but when we're taking these efforts in restoration, are you doing anything to be preventative for, God forbid, another one coming next year or 5 years from now as we're building back up?
Yeah, well, I think that's a key factor in how we look at all of these upgrades. We have to look at them and say, as we're making this new investment, how do we make them hardened, resilient? Should we have things that you can pack up and move? I mean, these are the questions that we need to answer as we develop new structures. Should our communications lines and our electric lines be buried to the extent they can? Those are the things that we absolutely will incorporate in our thinking about new facilities. Some of these repairs are just simply, the bathroom of a place of a broader building was impacted. And so in those, we're not looking at a major rehardening, if you will.
But the one photograph you show here, I mean, I toured that facility. That looks like a lot of work for the Department of Interior to be doing. I mean, I would think private contracts would be necessary to come help you fix those things up.
Yeah, those will absolutely be, I mean, there will be significant private contracting involved in the recovery.
For lack of a better term, you're going to farm that out. You're not using Department of Interior employees to do that. You're going to have to. You're going to have to farm.
There are certain things that Interior employees may very well do, but a ton of it will be contracted out.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I misrepresented.
No. I'm trying to be helpful. I'm not like I say these weren't trick questions, but yeah, obviously you can only do so much in house, and so much you have to farm out, and you've got a lot of work that needs to be done. So I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I know the Resource Committee is looking into this lease also, and I can, from my own experience, I would say that to develop something like that on an island where you may have a disaster again in 2 years or 20 years or maybe not, that's a significant risk. So that's something you don't want to lose a tenant and end up with a vacant piece of property either. So whoever you lease it to. But I don't think a 60-year lease from my perspective is unreasonable. Obviously the governor feels that way also. Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for being with us. I actually want to kind of hop on where Mr. Joyce ended and some of the resiliency questions that Ms. Pingree had. And I'm particularly interested in green infrastructure that might actually mitigate some of the damage. We heard from Fish and Wildlife that green infrastructure projects on some of the wildlife refuges actually help protect some of the inland areas and reduce some of the damage. I guess the McFadden National Wildlife Refuge has a dune system that protected the Port Arthur refinery and that mitigated some of the damage to the Port of Beaumont, which is the busiest military port that we have. I guess, and we see this conversation in my neck of the woods too, this notion that natural infrastructure might actually be a good buffer to some of the damage. To what extent is that part of this supplemental request? And I guess beyond that, I'm just curious if you have thoughts about what we could do to incent more of that green infrastructure development to promote not just conservation, but also to try to mitigate some of the damage when these events occur.
So I appreciate that question, and let me give you an answer that's probably not very politic, and that is this. When I received our request for this budget, I went through them line by line, and here's the factors I used. Number one, we need to take care of what we have responsibly. But number two, this supplemental, I assume, is a finite amount of money. And I know that people don't have homes, jobs, and if we're taking a dollar out of somebody else's pocket, I wanted to make sure I was comfortable with it. And so this request represents the stuff that I believe we absolutely need to do. I think that there is a lot of legitimate debate that can talk about what should our programs be, and should we use land morphology and other things for hardening facilities, and I don't have any qualm about that. I'm just not entirely sure that that is a supplemental emergency type discussion as much as a discussion with all of you and our other about the benefit of having these programs on a regular basis and making them part of our ongoing regular program.
Do you have thoughts about how we would do that as part of an ongoing regular program?
I would say I'm not an expert, but you know, we would devise up a program, pick some test sites, and do it. And I know it has been done in other hurricanes.
If the gentleman would yield
go
for
for
a
it.
minute. That's what my question was about Sandy. Some of the exact things that Mr. Kilmer was asking, this Congress said it was the right thing to do to mitigate future problems. So I think the Congress has shown that we do see a value to taxpayers in doing that. So I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The other question I want to ask about was just how much funding set aside for, within the supplemental, for habitat restoration. Obviously, there was a lot of damage to some of the refuges from the storms, and was also curious whether there's, that was covered within the areas damaged by the wildfires out west, too.
I'll have to get you a specific number. I think that most of these numbers are for facilities, debris removal, equipment. You know, I would say that I spent a lot, as I was working through the Everglades, I would say that the truth of the matter is that the environment itself held up pretty well. Our facilities, not so much.
Yep.
So that is the truth of the matter. I also want to respond back to the Miccosukee Indian School. I've been informed that it was not damaged during the hurricane. As a matter of fact, the electricity was off for a little while, though.
Thanks, Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Mr. Amity, but first, regarding resiliency, one thing that is what's going on in Puerto Rico, for instance, even though people would like to see a system built to a 5-category hurricane, that may not be practical. It may not be practical what the Virgin Islands are proposing. But one thing that can be done, as someone who's built things, is when you're building things like foundations and footings, drainage. That's one thing. You know, it's where if you lose the building, but the foundation and the footings are still there, you can rebuild on that footprint. That saves a tremendous amount of money. That doesn't really cost that much more money to do, and that's something that ought to be analyzed as you go into these things. But I just bring that up as a point. Mr. Amity.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Morning, David. You've talked about money for expedited permitting from SHPOs, State Historic Preservation Officers. So I'm assuming that we don't need money for expedited permitting from any agencies in the Department of Interior, or is that an incorrect assumption?
So the Section 106 money, I think that you're correct in that we believe that we have what we need.
Okay.
I'd have to make sure if any of that would actually be retained by the Park Service, and it may be.
Okay. Well, my only concern, potential concern is if we're plussing up permitting activities within our own agency to allow a different part of our own agency to do it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. I would just say that that might be something that needs to be pretty fully fleshed out so that we're not saying we did that. So if that's an issue later on, then get back with me. State SHPOs are good things, stuff like that, but when we talk about what things cost, and it's like the SHPO comes back and says, hey, wrong kind of siding, or wrong kind of light fixtures or whatever, that could have an impact on what this costs, right?
Well, it certainly could have an impact on what those individual owners are doing, et cetera, absolutely.
Okay, so I guess we need a footnote in there that just says, hey, well, if the SHPOs beat us up in these 7 states, we'll come back to you. I assume that would be the process, right? If you're out of,
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are prepared to come back to you for anything we need, absolutely.
and listen, I'm not anticipating that, but if that happens, it would be nice to know that it's like, hey, guess what? We got into a big wrestling match, I'm just speaking hypothetically, with the SHPO for XYZ jurisdiction, and guess what? What we thought was gonna cost $1 million is now a $3 million bill, and in the State Historic or the National Historic Preservation Act, we haven't got a way out. I'm also concerned in that in terms of if there's a disaster, if there needs to be something that's the equivalent of a nationwide whatever exemption or something for federal facilities to do their thing, because I'm assuming the fact that you've asked for that means that isn't in that statute right now.
Well, I think this request is more for recognizing that there is going to be a need to do greater SHPO work, not for our stuff, but for the stuff of private owners and others. And as a result of the National Historic Preservation Act, somebody's house may have been devastated, and so they're going to have a lot more. When they go deal with the SHPO, there's going to be a bigger line there than normal. And so this is to help facilitate that SHPO being able to move quicker so that the line is not as long.
Okay.
It's not really designed for us, for what we do on our properties.
So then I guess that leads me to the next one, is can you give me a feel for how much of this is for no kidding, U.S.-owned properties, whether it's parks, interior, wildlife, whoever, and what is for leased properties, which the U.S. does not own? Because
in terms of the facilities, I would have to come back to you with an answer to that, because I want to say the vast lion's share of what we're asking for, if it says construction, if it says facilities, if it says debris removal, those are happening on our properties, okay? With the exception that obviously USGS Dream Gauges all over. But to be honest, I am aware that at least in Puerto Rico, for example, the building that USGS operates is a rental. So there's some leaseholds that we would be working with.
And I guess the context of the question, to make it even more clear, is I would hope that the leases that the department has entered into, especially in areas that are prone to flooding, wind, and blah, 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 talk about whose responsibility it is to fix those. And if you end up having to fix it for a landlord, that we have a recovery mechanism so that we're not exposed to, we paid to fix Amadei's rental property that he's leasing out to XYZ.
That's a very good point. I will look into it.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Because that part of, and I understand you doing triage and prioritizing, and we expect that from you, and we're glad you do that. But the Historic Preservation Fund has grants, and you have, which means that there's a match on it. It's a grant. It is my understanding in this supplemental, whereas in past hurricanes, both Sandy and Katrina, and these are our fellow citizens, these are our territories, we're all in this together. In past hurricanes, both Sandy and Katrina, the Congress provided $50 million for Historic Preservation Fund grants. It's my understanding that at this point in time, on this supplemental, that is zero recommendation from the administration. And I think we're in agreement that we should start talking about making these grants available sooner rather than later, or maybe never. So is that correct? You're at zero? And if so, are you planning in the future for asking for what we did for other hurricanes? And you might need to go back. I know everybody's still crunching numbers, but I think you've heard from several of us that we don't know why we're treating this supplemental so differently.
Well, I'll be very honest with you, and I'm pretty certain that you're correct in your assumption of zero. And I would tell you that this is our request.
Just one more thing, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Yep, and this kind of follows on that. I have heard and understand the discussion on hardening of infrastructure and even the habitat-related one and all that, and that's fine. I would just say that part of me thinks, and from your background, you'll understand this, that there will be those of us watching in anticipation of passing meaningful legislation regarding other natural disasters, which may one day include fires. And so when we talk about restoring habitats in areas with endangered species, or that telephone poles burn sometimes and we think maybe it'd be better to put them underground, and I'm just throwing that out there off the top of my head, that this will be precedent setting as far as how we, different hardening is in different environments. And so I'll just throw that out and say, I'm looking forward to seeing how you folks do this, and it ought to be fun. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Capter.
Thank you very much, Secretary Bernhardt, for being here today.
You got your mic? Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for being here, for your experience and for your work. How capable is the government of Puerto Rico in planning for its own future and the rebuilding of the island? Or, through the funding that we provide, do we have to assure that there are expert land planners? I haven't seen it in all the hearings we've been in on our energy subcommittee, on this subcommittee. This is the first map I've seen that even, I mean, this is like 1% of what we need in order to intelligently plan rebuilding. And I support the money for USGS, the $20 million plus that's in here. Excellent decision there. But who's actually in charge of the planning? You've got a really complex topographical and geologic situation here, quite unusual, different than Texas, different than Florida. And I keep asking the question, where is the key land planning lodged? Who's doing that? How do you answer that question?
Well, I try and answer that question very honestly. And my first point would be that the one place I know it's not lodged is the Department of the Interior.
Okay, all right.
But that said, in general, if we were dealing with your home state, that would all be very clear, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And so I think that is a bit of what I spoke about earlier in terms of the magnitude of dealing with this particular challenge. Now, those, it's very easy for us at Interior to account for the properties that we manage and administer.
Could you superimpose, we don't have a map, I don't have a map of that after I don't know how many heurings we've had.
You know what, I certainly should be able, and I'm going to say should so I don't let you down, but I should be able to give you a map of Puerto Rico and anywhere else you want that has where our holdings primarily are.
I'll just share with you that when we had Army Corps before us on the Energy Committee, they gave us a map with none of this, some lines, sort of showing us where maybe the grid might be restored.
I think I'm familiar with that map.
But it doesn't, the elevation, the streams, because I keep saying to myself the question, well, okay, so if this is vulnerable again, what about geothermal? Does that make sense? And if so, where? So if we're going to be doing something in a national park or restoring whatever here, that you can wheel out power to other places, because obviously the island's very, 1950s in terms of its infrastructure. And, but I don't really, I guess what's got me more and more concerned as I sit here in these hearings is it's fragmented. There isn't really a team that has a leader that thinks about how you put the components together.
The way it's actually set up now as we move into the recovery is FEMA will continue to be the leader, I believe. And then we have, for example, we have a very specific role in the longer-term recovery, and that role is basically natural resources, natural and cultural resources. That falls to us. And the strategy does have different players with different pieces.
And who has that team?
Who determines the team?
Which
or?
human being in the United States of America's government heads that team?
I can get you that name this afternoon.
Okay. You think they're lodged at FEMA?
I'm certain of that.
Okay. I have another question dealing with two topics that do not relate to rebuilding here. One is whether the department intends to double the entry fees for national parks, for selected national parks. Is that still a front burner item there, or have you sort of become more reasonable?
Well, I believe that we extended the comment period. The comment period is extended for a while. We'll get additional comment. After we get a comment, which is on a proposal to raise fees at 15 parks, after we get that comment, we'll address the comment and I'm sure make a decision and communicate with you at that time.
All right, very good. I'm glad it's under review. I don't think the American people should be saddled with higher fees in view of everything. You know, in my area, people haven't had a raise in 20 years. And sometimes the national parks are the only place that's where they go for vacations. And sometimes they don't go to Denali because they can't afford the gas to get out there. But you know, even the dunes up in Michigan and places like that, you know, that it's expensive to travel. So I kept thinking, well, probably because our national parks are so overcrowded, they're charging an entry fee to keep people out. I mean, you know, you want to regulate, that's what the Russians would do.
It's 15
Make it
parks.
harder to get someplace. I hope we're not going that direction in this country. We'd like our people to enjoy the natural resources of this country. We need to increase your budget so that you have the kind of staffing and the improvements that are needed at these parks. So that's my point of view. But my second question is, what about, is the department reconsidering the import of trophy elephants based on what the president has done? Is it rescinded?
The department is absolutely reviewing the program across the board and absolutely doing that.
All right.
You put a stay on it for the moment then?
So as it relates to Zimbabwe, there was a suspension of an endangerment finding that was modified and that has been resuspended.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. We got into, Ms. Capter talked about maps, and I, you know, obviously concerned about what's going on, not just because of the recent hurricanes, and part of this $20 million for the USGS is to potentially collect data that would be helpful in the future for we can model for future events. And as you may know, 245,000 acres in Northern California, 8,900 structures, 6,900 of those were homes. That environment was significantly disrupted. And we hope that there would be value in collecting a three-dimensional elevation mapping data for these areas affected by the wildfires. The USGS 3D elevation program typically partners with state and local entities who share costs of acquiring that data, as you know. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are not capable of doing that, so we need to make sure we get this data collected. They're unable because they're both bankrupt. It's pretty well known. And getting a cost-sharing agreement from a stone is impossible. So I would hope that that we would also look at, though, at California. You may want to comment a little bit about California while you're here, David.
So I don't have anything in our request as it relates to that specifically, but I do know that that data would be very helpful and very important. Yeah. Elevation plays a key role in assessments of the speed of which things move, et cetera, and it would be helpful information to have.
Right. My prediction, of course, is that this is not going to be the last supplemental. We're going to hopefully do the supplemental soon. We'll be working together to look at your proposal and the administration's proposal and from the interior perspective, and try to fashion something that is going to work. And then we'll be looking down the road at what hasn't been evaluated, because I know that not all the evaluations have been done.
That's true.
And we need to look at this seriously and see what we can do about this in the future supplemental that we'll have. With that, Ms. McCollum, do you have any additional questions or comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is more of just putting this on the record. You know, it's clear that citizens of this country expect to be treated fairly and with equity. And the citizens in the two areas that we've been focused on, mostly the Virgin Islands and the Puerto Rico islands, have found themselves with formulas and cost shares in the past that have impacted dramatically, I'd say punitively, our fellow citizens in both of these territories. And as the chairman pointed out, and as we do quite often on the Appropriations Committee, we're trying to equalize that all across the board, not just in our Appropriations Subcommittee, but in others. And so when it comes to waivers and cross-sharing, I would hope that the Department of Insular Affairs would work with us to point out where these inequities and these injustices lie, to do something about it, and also, as the chairman pointed out, take into account that many of our fellow citizens in these territories, their governments, you know, can't do these matches, can't do these waivers. So it sounds good on paper, but what we're actually delivering to our fellow citizens might fall far short. With that, both the chairman and I serve on the Department of Defense, and so I've been bringing this up every time, and I just want to know where we are with the Vieques Island cleanup. That shouldn't fall on the Department of Interior when it's unexploded ordnance and that. So I know that people were working together to get an assessment on that. If you could either elaborate on it today and let me know how it's going with the Department of Defense. Mr. Chairman, I'm speaking for both of us right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you and I'd be happy to bring both parties together, being on both committees, Interior and Defense, to make sure this is done in an expedited fashion, and that the Department of Defense expedites anything it needs to do in the cleanup on that. It should not fall solely on the Department of Interior to take the lead when you have so many other things to do there. So anything you want to enlighten the chair and I about, or anything, we stand ready to help you.
I will commit that if we have problems, we'll come talk to both of you on that, and I'm very sensitive to the California stuff, and we'll work with you on it.
What's that? Did you have an additional question, Mr. Evans? Okay, no additional question. Well, thank you. I appreciate your coming out here today, and good luck. You know, I know you just started. You got a lot of work to do, but thanks for what you're doing, and we'll see you soon, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.